What happens when the league tries to control the narrative, but accidentally creates its loudest rebel? Because Sophie Cunningham was never supposed to be this player. She wasn't drafted to be the face of anything. She wasn't marketed as a superstar. And she definitely wasn't expected to become the most outspoken defender of Caitlin Clark. But that's exactly what happened. As the season unfolded, something inside the WNBA cracked. Hard fouls went uncalled. Cheap shots were ignored. And every time Caitlin Clark absorbed another hit with no whistle, fans grew louder. Then Sophie stopped staying quiet. What started as simple competitiveness turned into something far bigger. And before the league realized what it had done, Sophie Cunningham went from role player to the most uncomfortable problem the WNBA had created for itself. Long before Indiana, Sophie Cunningham already had a reputation. Not flashy, not polished, just relentless. She was the kind of player opponents hated to play against and teammates loved having beside them. Physical, vocal, emotional. The type who didn't back down just because someone had a bigger name or a bigger platform. But for years, that edge stayed contained. She was labeled fiery, sometimes too much, and almost always overlooked in league-wide conversations. No major marketing push. No headline treatment. No protected status. And honestly, that worked for the league. Because players like Sophie are useful when they stay quiet. They bring intensity, absorb contact, and keep the game gritty without demanding attention. That's who she was supposed to be. Until she landed in Indiana. Because the moment Sophie Cunningham stepped onto the same floor as Caitlin Clark, everything changed. Not just for her career, but for how visible the league's cracks were about to become. And whether the WNBA realized it or not, they had just placed the wrong person next to the wrong star. Caitlin Clark didn't just enter the league. She disrupted it. From the moment she stepped onto a WNBA court, the attention shifted. Arenas filled faster. Ratings jumped. Merch started flying off shelves. And with that attention came something the league never fully prepared for: resentment. Because Caitlin wasn't just popular. She was inescapable. Every game revolved around her. Every broadcast mentioned her. And every opposing defense made sure she felt it physically. Hard bumps turned into patterns. Close calls stopped being called. And suddenly, the face of the league was absorbing contact that would have drawn instant whistles for almost anyone else. Fans noticed immediately. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't occasional. It was consistent enough that even casual viewers started asking the same question. Why does she never get the call? Inside the league, things felt even stranger. Some players brushed it off as rookie treatment. Others framed it as earning respect. But the reality was harder to ignore. Caitlin Clark was carrying the league's momentum, while being officiated like she hadn't earned basic protection. And Sophie Cunningham saw it clearly. Not from highlight clips. Not from social media outrage. But from being right there on the floor, watching it happen possession after possession. What stood out wasn't just the contact. It was the silence afterward. No accountability. No consistency. No urgency to protect the player, bringing in the largest audience the league had seen in years. And for Sophie, that wasn't just frustrating, it was personal. Because when you play the way Sophie plays, you recognize patterns fast. You know when a game is being managed instead of officiated. And you know when someone's being treated differently on purpose. That's when Sophie stopped seeing Caitlin as just a teammate. She saw her as a target. And once that clicked, there was no going back. Because if the league wasn't going to protect its biggest star, someone else was going to step in. And Sophie Cunningham was never the type to wait for permission. At first, Sophie didn't make a big show of it. There were no dramatic speeches, no viral clips, no carefully crafted statements meant to grab attention. It was subtler than that. A comment here. A look there. A tone that made it clear she wasn't buying the league's version of events when it came to Caitlin Clark. And fans picked up on it immediately. Because in a league where most players danced around the topic, Sophie said what felt obvious. Caitlin wasn't just another rookie trying to earn respect. She was already changing the game, and the way she was being treated didn't match her impact. Sophie talked about it casually, almost offhand, which somehow made it hit harder. It didn't sound rehearsed. It sounded real. That honesty stood out. Especially after a season where so many voices seemed hesitant to fully acknowledge Caitlyn's influence. Analysts downplayed it. Opponents dismissed it. Even parts of the league felt oddly quiet about the obvious surge in attention Caitlyn brought with her. So when Sophie spoke up, it felt less like hot takes and more like someone finally saying what everyone could already see. But that honesty came with a cost. Once Sophie publicly aligned herself with Caitlyn, the tone around her changed. She wasn't just competitive anymore. She was suddenly too aggressive, too emotional, doing too much. The same traits that had defined her career were reframed the moment she used them to defend the league's biggest star. And that's when fans really locked in. Because they recognized the pattern. Sophie wasn't being criticized for what she did. She was being criticized for who she did it for. Defending Caitlyn Clark wasn't neutral territory. It came with baggage, resentment, and pushback from corners of the league that weren't ready to accept how much the spotlight had shifted. Sophie didn't flinch. If anything, she leaned in. Not louder. Not reckless. Just firmer. More direct. More unapologetic about where she stood. And in doing that, she crossed an invisible line. She stopped being just another player on the roster and became something far more uncomfortable for the league. She became visible. And once that happens, there's no putting it back in the box. The warning signs didn't show up all at once. They crept in quietly, disguised as physical basketball, and brushed off as part of the game. Early matchups started feeling different, especially in moments when Caitlyn Clark didn't even have the ball. Extra contact after whistles. Bumps that lingered a second too long. Little things that, on their own, were easy to ignore, but together told a much bigger story. And the refs let it happen. Preseason games were supposed to be low-stakes tune-ups, but for Indiana, they turned into something else entirely. Caitlyn was getting tested immediately, not just by veterans trying to send a message, but by players who clearly felt emboldened. There was no hesitation, no fear of consequences. It was as if everyone already knew the line could be crossed without punishment. That's when Sophie stepped in. Not with a cheap shot. Not with theatrics. Just presence. A stare. Words exchanged. A clear signal that whatever was happening wasn't going to be free anymore. It wasn't dramatic enough to make headlines, but it mattered. Because players on the court understand those moments. They know when someone is saying, "That ends now." But it didn't end. Instead, it escalated. Each game made the pattern harder to deny. Caitlyn absorbed hit after hit, while whistles stayed silent. Meanwhile, similar contact on the other end suddenly became fouls. The inconsistency wasn't subtle anymore. It was glaring. And that's when frustration turned into something sharper. For Sophie, this wasn't about protecting a rookie's feelings. It was about the integrity of the game. If the league wanted Caitlyn Clark to carry its momentum, then letting her get hammered without protection wasn't toughness, it was negligence. And Sophie could see exactly where this was heading if nobody pushed back. The problem was, pushing back came with a price. Because the moment Sophie started making her presence felt, she wasn't just challenging opponents. She was challenging the structure that allowed it to happen. And once that happens, you're no longer just playing basketball, you're testing the league itself. And the league was about to fail that test in a very public way. By the time the Connecticut game arrived, the tension had already been building for weeks. Nothing about it felt normal. You could sense it from the opening minutes, the way contact was allowed to pile up without consequence, the way Caitlyn Clark was being treated like a problem to be managed instead of a player to be protected. Every possession felt heavier, more volatile, like something was waiting to snap. And then it did. Caitlyn took hit after hit, the kind that stops momentum and wears a player down mentally as much as physically. Arms reaching in where they didn't belong. Bodies crashing into her space with no intention of making a clean play. The whistles never came. What made it worse was the contrast. Soft calls on one end, nothing on the other. It wasn't just bad officiating. It felt deliberate. Sophie saw all of it. She watched Caitlyn get swiped at, knocked off balance, and sent to the floor while play kept moving like nothing happened. No warnings. No control. No message from the officials that the game was going to be reined in. And that's when the frustration stopped being internal. Sophie didn't react out of nowhere. She reacted because the line had already been crossed too many times. When she finally stepped in, it wasn't reckless or chaotic. It was pointed. A clear response to the message the game had been sending all night. If the refs weren't going to protect Caitlin, someone else would. That moment hit differently for fans. For months, they had been watching Caitlin take punishment with no backup, wondering when, or if, someone would finally push back. When Sophie did, it felt like release. Not because of violence, but because of accountability. For the first time, there was visible resistance to what everyone had been complaining about. And in that instant, Sophie Cunningham stopped being just another teammate. She became a symbol. A symbol of what the league refused to do. A symbol of what Caitlin had been missing. And a symbol of a bigger problem the WNBA could no longer ignore. Because once that moment went viral, there was no spinning it away. The game ended, but the story was just beginning. The reaction was immediate. Not gradual. Not subtle. Immediate. Within hours, clips from that Connecticut game were everywhere. Not because of the score or the stat lines, but because fans finally saw someone do what they had been begging for all season. Sophie didn't posture. She didn't apologize. She didn't soften the moment to make it easier for the league to digest. She stood on it. And fans loved her for it. Suddenly, Sophie Cunningham wasn't being talked about like a role player anymore. Her name was everywhere. Social media flooded with praise. Comment sections turned into thank you notes. People who had never paid attention to her career before were suddenly learning everything they could about her. Jerseys sold out. Follow counts jumped. And the narrative around her flipped almost overnight. What made it even more powerful was how natural it felt. Sophie didn't try to reinvent herself to fit the moment. She didn't pretend to be something she wasn't. She leaned into the same intensity she had always played with, and for once, it was being celebrated instead of criticized. Fans recognized that authenticity instantly. This wasn't clout chasing. This was someone finally being seen. That connection mattered. Because Caitlin Clark's fanbase wasn't just large. It was engaged, vocal, and deeply frustrated with how the league had handled her. When Sophie stepped in, it felt like someone inside the system was finally saying, "You're not crazy. We see it too." And that kind of validation builds loyalty fast. Sophie leaned into it just enough. A post here. A subtle wink there. Nothing overproduced. Nothing forced. Just enough to acknowledge the moment without cheapening it. And every time she did, her platform grew larger. Her voice carried further. And the league's ability to control the narrative shrank. That's when the tone started to shift. Because the WNBA wasn't just dealing with a viral clip anymore. They were dealing with a player whose popularity was growing faster than their tolerance for dissent. Sophie had accidentally become one of the most relatable figures in the league, and that made her dangerous. Not because she was reckless, but because she was honest. Once the noise got too loud to ignore, the pushback came exactly how you'd expect. Not toward the moments that started everything. Not toward the missed calls or the unchecked physicality. The response landed on Sophie. Media coverage shifted almost overnight. The same outlets that barely mentioned the hits Caitlin Clark was taking suddenly had plenty to say about Sophie's reaction. Words like unsportsmanlike and crossing the line started popping up, while the original incidents quietly faded into the background. It was a familiar pattern. Address the response, ignore the cause. And then came the fine. On paper, it was supposed to send a message. A reminder of who holds the power. But in reality, it did the opposite. Instead of cooling things down, it confirmed what fans already believed, that the league was more interested in protecting its image than fixing the problem. Sophie didn't backpedal. She didn't issue a carefully worded apology. She didn't pretend the moment was misunderstood. If anything, her tone sharpened. Not reckless, not chaotic, just more direct. The league had made its move, and Sophie responded by refusing to be managed. That's when fans realized something important. The fines didn't scare her. They annoyed her. And there's a huge difference between the two. Because when a player stops worrying about consequences, the usual pressure tactics stop working. Sophie wasn't trying to be a villain. She just wasn't willing to play quiet anymore. Around this time, more people started paying closer attention, not just to Sophie, but to what she was actually saying. And if you were already following the situation, this was probably the moment you realized this story wasn't going to fade away quietly. It was only getting louder. And the league felt it. Because every attempt to rein Sophie in only seemed to strengthen the connection between her and the fans. The more they pushed, the more visible the double standard became. And once that kind of trust forms between a player and the audience, it's almost impossible to undo. The WNBA wanted control. What they created instead was momentum. By this point, Sophie understood the reality of the situation. Staying quiet wasn't going to protect her, and backing off wasn't going to change anything. The line had already been crossed, and the league had made it clear that silence was the preferred option. Sophie chose the opposite. She stopped filtering. Not in a reckless, attention-seeking way, but in a way that felt refreshingly honest. Comments that used to stay behind closed doors started coming out in public. She talked about officiating inconsistencies. She questioned decisions that fans had been questioning all along. And instead of softening her words to avoid backlash, she said them plainly. That was the moment her voice really took off. Short clips spread faster than full interviews ever could. Fans didn't need context. They already understood what she was reacting to. It felt like Sophie was speaking directly to them, not over them. And every time one of those clips took off, the gap between the league's messaging and the audience's experience got wider. Some people tried to paint it as a phase. Others called it emotional. But the pattern was clear. Sophie wasn't lashing out. She was responding. And the more consistently she responded, the harder it became to dismiss her as just being fiery. Around the middle of the season, this was also when a lot of casual viewers started sticking around. Not just for the games, but for the conversations around them. Sophie became one of the few players who felt accessible, who sounded like a real person reacting in real time instead of a media-trained spokesperson. And if you've been following along up to this point, this is probably where it made sense to stay. Not because of drama, but because it felt like something bigger was unfolding in real time. Moments like this don't happen often, and when they do, they usually change the league in ways no one expects. The WNBA didn't just have a player speaking out anymore. They had a growing audience that wanted to hear everything she said next. The turning point came when Sophie realized something simple but powerful. As long as she stayed inside the league's usual media lanes, her words could always be trimmed, reframed, or ignored. So she stepped outside of them. When she launched her own platform, everything changed. This wasn't a post-game quote that could be clipped out of context or buried behind a headline. This was Sophie speaking in full thoughts, uninterrupted, saying exactly what she meant. She talked about locker room culture, about how Caitlin Clark was discussed when cameras weren't rolling, about how physical play crossed into something else the moment Caitlin stepped on the floor. And for the first time, fans were hearing it directly from someone living it. What made it hit harder was how casual it sounded. Sophie wasn't ranting. She wasn't performing outrage. She spoke the way people talk when they finally stop pretending everything is fine. That tone made it impossible to dismiss her as bitter or dramatic. It felt grounded, familiar, real. She didn't just confirm what fans suspected, she filled in the gaps. Stories about welcoming rookies suddenly sounded different. Talk about earning respect felt hollow. And the idea that Caitlin was being treated like everyone else completely fell apart once Sophie explained how differently the game was being called depending on who had the ball. This is also where her audience really solidified. People weren't just watching clips anymore. They were sticking around, listening, engaging. And if you're someone who likes hearing the unfiltered side of what actually happens inside professional sports, this was the kind of voice you didn't want to lose track of. That's why so many viewers quietly hit subscribe around this time, not because they were told to, but because they didn't want to miss what came next. The league couldn't find this away. Every attempt to respond only pushed more attention toward her platform. And the more Sophie talked, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about one game or one player. It was about a system that struggled the moment it was forced into the spotlight. And Sophie wasn't done forcing that spotlight. By the time Sophie said it out loud, most fans had already been thinking it for weeks. The difference was, Sophie didn't dress it up or soften it. She just pointed to what was happening and let the contrast speak for itself. On one side, you had Caitlin Clark, the player driving ratings, selling out arenas, and pulling new eyes into the league every night. Still getting bumped. Still getting grabbed. Still playing through contact that rarely got acknowledged. Deep into her second year, the whistle still felt optional. On the other side, you had a different story unfolding. Another young star entered the league and immediately received a level of protection Caitlin had never been afforded. Light contact turned into quick calls. Drives to the basket came with instant whistles. The difference wasn't subtle. It was obvious enough that even neutral fans started asking why the standards weren't the same. Sophie didn't attack the player. She attacked the inconsistency. She made it clear that talent wasn't the issue and popularity wasn't the issue. The issue was fairness. If the league wanted to market stars, then the rules needed to apply evenly. You couldn't let one player get hammered night after night while another was wrapped in protection and pretend that was normal. That's when the reaction came fast. Another fine. Another attempt to send a message. Another reminder that some conversations were apparently off-limits. But by now, the pattern was undeniable. Every time Sophie pointed out a double standard, the league responded not by addressing it, but by penalizing the person who said it. And that response told its own story. Fans didn't see accountability. They saw confirmation. Confirmation that the problem wasn't imagined. Confirmation that certain truths made the league uncomfortable. And confirmation that Sophie was hitting close enough to reality that it needed to be shut down. Except it couldn't be. Because once a double standard is visible, it's impossible to unsee. And thanks to Sophie, it was now out in the open, backed by clips, experiences, and voices from inside the game itself. The conversation had officially shifted. And the league was running out of ways to control it. Eventually, the season took something from Sophie that no fine ever could: her ability to stay on the floor. The injury shut down the physical part of her game, at least for the moment, and with it came an assumption from some corners of the league that the noise would finally die down. No more confrontations. No more in-game moments to clip and circulate. That assumption didn't last long. Because while Sophie couldn't play, she could still speak. And without the nightly grind of games, her perspective only sharpened. She wasn't reacting in the heat of the moment anymore. She was reflecting on patterns she had lived through, watched closely, and now had the space to explain. If anything, the injury expanded her reach. Her voice carried beyond box scores and post-game quotes. She wasn't just reacting to single plays anymore. She was talking about culture. About how stars are treated. About how the league responds when honesty doesn't align with its preferred image. And fans didn't drift away. They leaned in. What stood out most was how consistent she stayed. There was no sudden change in tone. No attempt to soften her message now that she was sidelined. She spoke the same way she always had, direct, grounded, and clearly protective of Caitlin Clark. That consistency built trust, especially with fans who had watched Caitlin take hit after hit while the conversation around her stayed strangely divided. At this point, Sophie wasn't just part of the story anymore. She had become a reference point. When fans talked about officiating, her words came up. When debates about league treatment surfaced, her perspective anchored them. And when people discussed Caitlin's impact versus how she was handled, Sophie's stance made it harder to dismiss those concerns as overreaction. The league had lost the ability to frame her. And that's when it became clear this wasn't about a single season. It was about what happens when a player understands her platform and decides not to give it back, even when the game itself is taken away. In the end, this was never just about Sophie Cunningham. And it was never just about Caitlin Clark either. It was about what happens when a league grows faster than its willingness to adapt. Caitlin changed the WNBA whether it was ready or not. She brought attention, pressure, and expectations the league hadn't fully prepared for. Instead of protecting that momentum, it hesitated. Instead of setting a clear standard, it allowed inconsistencies to pile up. And in doing that, it created the exact conditions for someone like Sophie to step forward. Sophie didn't set out to become a problem. She became one because the league left a vacuum. Fans were frustrated. Questions went unanswered. And the person closest to the situation decided she wasn't going to pretend everything was fine. That's what made her so powerful. She didn't speak like a spokesperson. She spoke like a teammate. Like someone who had watched Caitlyn take unnecessary punishment while carrying the weight of the league's attention. Like someone who understood that silence only benefits the people already in control. And once that honesty reached the audience, there was no pulling it back. The fines didn't work. The criticism didn't land. The attempts to reframe the story only made the gaps more obvious. Because every time the league tried to quiet Sophie, it reinforced the same message fans had already picked up on, that the truth was inconvenient. Now, Sophie represents something bigger than one season or one controversy. She's proof that the league's biggest threat isn't criticism from the outside. It's voices from the inside that fans trust. Voices that aren't afraid to say what's happening, even when it makes leadership uncomfortable. And until the WNBA figures out how to protect its stars, address its inconsistencies, and embrace the growth Caitlin Clark brought with her, that voice isn't going away. If anything, it's just getting louder. If you made it all the way through, make sure you show some love by hitting like, dropping your thoughts in the comments, and subscribing for more breakdowns like this. Let me know what you think about Sophie's role in all of this, because this conversation isn't ending anytime soon.